August 1965. Things were incredibly tense. It hadn't been that long, really, since the first war over Kashmir and that border. I mean, it was still a raw nerve.
Absolutely. And it was about to erupt again, not just a skirmish either.
No, this was full-scale war. We're talking tanks rolling, dogfights in the air, huge numbers of troops moving on both sides, India and Pakistan. A massive escalation.
Yeah, it caught a lot of people off guard, the sheer scale of it so quickly.
So for this deep dive, we're focusing on that conflict, the Second Indo-Pak War, 1965. And specifically, how it all kicked off with something called Operation Gibraltar.
Right, Operation Gibraltar. It sounds quite grand, doesn't it? But it was essentially a covert Pakistani operation. A really audacious gamble, actually.
Okay, break that down. What was Gibraltar?
Well, the plan involved sending thousands of Pakistani-trained soldiers across the line of control into Indian-administered Kashmir.
Right, covertly.
Exactly. They were disguised as locals. The idea, the hope, maybe the assumption from Pakistan's side was that they could spark a general uprising.
Among the local Muslim population there.
Yes. Pakistan seemed to believe they'd be seen as liberators, that the population was just waiting for this push to rise up against Indian rule.
That sounds like a massive assumption, a huge political risk.
Yeah.
Did they misread the situation on the ground?
Fundamentally, yes. That's the crucial point. This belief in this imminent widespread revolt. It just wasn't grounded in the reality of Kashmiri sentiment at the time.
So instead of finding crowds welcoming them?
They found themselves pretty isolated. And crucially, people started reporting their presence to the Indian authorities.
Wow. So the infiltrators were actually being given up by the very people they thought would support them.
Precisely. That lack of local support, that failure to anticipate the reaction was the critical flaw. The whole plan started to unravel almost immediately.
And the Indian military's reaction?
It was swift. They engaged the infiltrators, started pushing them back, and it became clear very, very quickly this wasn't just another border incident.
This was something much bigger.
Definitely. A major escalation was underway, initiated by Pakistan, and India realized it needed a much more significant response than just dealing with infiltrators in Kashmir.
Okay, so Operation Gibraltar fails to ignite the uprising. India pushes back. What's the next major step?
India's big move came in early September. They decided to escalate significantly by crossing the international border.
Not just the line of control in Kashmir, but the recognized border further south.
Exactly. Into the Lahore and Sialkot sectors in Punjab. This was a game changer.
Why that specific move? What was the strategy there?
It was about relieving pressure on their forces in Kashmir. By opening a new front, threatening major Pakistani cities like Lahore, they forced Pakistan to divert troops and resources away from the Kashmir sector. It was a direct challenge.
So the war suddenly got much wider.
Oh, massively. The fighting spread out of the mountains. Now you had major battles happening in Jammu, across Punjab, even down into Rajasthan, the desert areas.
You mentioned Lahore. I mean, cities like Amritsar on the Indian side, Lahore on the Pakistani side, they were suddenly right near the front lines.
Yes, bracing for attack, dealing with the realities of war hitting close to home. It changed the whole complexion of the conflict.
And within this wider war, wasn't there a particularly famous tank battle?
Yes. You're probably thinking of the Battle of Asal Uttar near Kemkaran in Punjab.
That's the one. It's often called a tank graveyard.
It is, and it's iconic because it was such an unexpected victory for India, kind of a David versus Goliath story in tank terms.
How so?
Well, you had Pakistan's first armored division equipped with these highly rated American Patton tanks, very modern, very powerful, seen as almost invincible, perhaps.
Okay, the best they had. Who are they up against?
India's 4th Mountain Division. Now, as the name suggests, not primarily an armored unit, they weren't expected to win a tank-on-tank fight against the Pattons.
But they did. How?
Tactical brilliance, really. The Indian commanders used the terrain. They deliberately flooded the sugarcane fields in the area.
Flooded them with water?
Yeah, breached canals. It turned the firm ground the Pattons needed to maneuver into a muddy bog.
So the tanks got stuck.
Exactly. Over 90 Pakistani tanks, many of them Pattons, were literally trapped in the mud, sitting ducks. It completely stalled their advance and led to huge losses for them.
That's incredible, turning the landscape itself into a weapon.
It shattered the myth of the Patton tank's superiority and was a massive morale boost for India early in the war, a really decisive moment on that front.
And amidst these big battles, these tactical moves, there are always stories of individual courage.
Absolutely. And one that stands out from Asal Uttar is Company Quartermaster Havildar Abdul Hamid.
Tell us about him.
He was part of the 4th Grenadiers. He used a jeep-mounted recoilless rifle, essentially a relatively small anti-tank gun.
Against Patton tanks.
Yes. He positioned himself well and, despite intense shelling and fire, is credited with knocking out several Pakistani tanks single-handedly.
Wow. That takes immense bravery.
Tragically, he was killed in action while engaging another tank. But his actions were legendary. He was posthumously awarded the Param Vir Chakra, India's highest military gallantry award.
A true hero. Stories like his really underscore the human element, the sheer guts involved.
Definitely. It wasn't just about tanks and tactics, it was about individual soldiers making incredible sacrifices.
So we have this fierce ground war escalating, major tank battles.
Yeah.
What's happening in the air? And internationally.
Well, the Air Forces were heavily involved, too. Both the Indian Air Force and the Pakistan Air Force flew hundreds, maybe thousands, of sorties.
Sorties being individual combat flights.
Right. They were hitting airfields, bombing supply lines, engaging each other in dogfights. Control of the skies was crucial.
And the wider world was watching this unfold.
Oh, absolutely. The U.S. and the Soviet Union, the big Cold War players, were getting very concerned. They didn't want a full-blown, prolonged war between India and Pakistan, especially given their own complex relationships with both countries.
So diplomatic pressure started building.
Yes, significant pressure from both Washington and Moscow for a ceasefire. Neither superpower saw benefit in this escalating further.
Meanwhile, for ordinary people in those cities near the front, Lahore, Amritsar, life must have been terrifying.
Unimaginable, really. Constant threat of air raids, shelling, people seeking shelter, lives totally disrupted. Public morale, it swung wildly on both sides. Patriotic fervor 1 minute, deep fear the next.
So how did it end? All this intense fighting.
It ended relatively quickly, actually. After about 17 days of this really high-intensity warfare, a ceasefire was brokered by the United Nations.
And what was that?
It came into effect on September 22nd, 1965.
And the outcome? Who won?
Well, that's the interesting part. Both sides claimed victory. They highlighted specific battles, specific acts of bravery to their own people.
But militarily, on the ground.
It was essentially a stalemate. Neither side achieved a decisive victory or made significant, lasting territorial gains. The lines ended up pretty much where they started.
But stalemates still come at a huge cost.
Oh, enormous. We're talking over 3,000 soldiers killed on both sides, thousands more wounded. The physical and emotional scars ran deep and lasted long after the ceasefire.
So going back to Operation Gibraltar, that initial gamble,
Yeah.
what were the longer-term consequences of its failure and the war that followed?
It led to some major rethinking on both sides. For India, there was a real determination to strengthen its military further, become more self-reliant in defense. They felt they'd stood their ground effectively.
And for Pakistan?
Well, the failure of Gibraltar, the lack of that expected uprising in Kashmir, and the overall military stalemate led them to reassess their strategy, too. They perhaps felt let down by allies or realized certain approaches hadn't worked, leading them to look towards new alliances, like strengthening ties with China and different strategic doctrines.
So the war, even ending in stalemate, shifted mindsets.
Definitely. It was a catalyst for change in military planning and foreign policy for both nations.
Was there any formal peace agreement?
Yes. In January 1966, mediated by the Soviet Union, leaders from India and Pakistan met in Tashkent, Uzbekistan.
The Tashkent Agreement.
Right. They agreed to withdraw forces back to the pre-war lines, restore diplomatic ties. It aimed to restore peace.
But did it resolve the underlying issues, like Kashmir?
Not really. That's the key thing. It papered over the cracks, perhaps, restored the status quo ante, but the fundamental dispute over Kashmir remained completely unresolved, just waiting to flare up again.
So the big takeaway for you listening, this 1965 war really hammered home that Kashmir wasn't just some remote regional dispute.
Exactly. It showed it had the terrifying potential to ignite a full-scale conventional war between two major South Asian powers, a potential that sadly hasn't entirely gone away.
And looking ahead, our next deep dive will move forward just a few years to 1971, a conflict that was in many ways even more devastating.
Yes, a much darker chapter, really. A war fought on two fronts, leading to immense human suffering and ultimately the creation of a new nation, Bangladesh.
So as we wrap up this look at 1965, maybe a final thought for you to ponder. History isn't just stuff that happened back then.
Right. It's alive. It shapes the present, the borders, the politics, the relationships we see today. Thinking about 1965, what echoes of that conflict, those decisions, those unresolved issues, can you still see playing out in the region now? It's something worth considering.